Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Triangle Area SQL Server User Group's Advanced DBA subsession. So this month, I'm pleased to be able to have James Serra talk to us about Azure Synapse Analytics. And there's a lot to this, so I am excited to for you to dive in, James. So if you could take it away, please.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. So a quick background on me. I'm a data and AI architect at Microsoft, what we call Microsoft Technology Center, MTC, in New York City. And I spend most of my day in architect design sessions with customers. It used to be all in person. Now, obviously, it's all virtual and will be for some time. So I spend the day educating them about Microsoft's products or concepts like the data lake and the data warehouse. And a big part of that, especially recently, the past few months, has been on Azure Synapse Analytics. And having been at Microsoft during those 6 years of a number of different roles, all focused on data and AI. And did I bring up my, let me pull up my little slide here. I think I had it. Nope, I didn't. And the history before that was I've been involved in SQL Server since 1989, version 1.0, and all through the years I've been a DBA and a developer, and I was a SQL MVP until I went to Microsoft, and have been involved in a lot of discussions with customers on building a data warehouse. And recently, of course, it's been a data warehouse in the cloud. And I'm going to assume that you know very little about Azure. So some of this may be high level, but I'll pause many times. I'll take questions from the chat room. So as we go along the way, I can answer any of your questions. If we look at the modern data warehouse, and this is where I spend a lot of time with customers on these various stages, they're going to take data from many different sources, and they want to make better business decisions. They want to get more insights to the data. And they maybe have something on-prem, but they're running out of space or compute power or maintenance windows. They just can't handle all the additional types of data, which usually gets into social media data, IoT data. They could wind up ingesting a bunch of Twitter data to find out what people are saying about their company and their products. Meanwhile, they maybe want to pull in competitor data or Facebook data. They have IoT devices and they want to pull in this data, and they could maybe even stream it. And then they have all this on-prem data. So the first thing you've got to do is ingest it into the cloud, and that's where typically it's using Azure Data Factory. It's sort of the SSIS of the cloud, and you can land that data in the data lake storage here on the bottom. And this data lake storage becomes the landing zone of all types of data on there. Now, you can go into a long discussion on how you set up the data lake, which is outside the scope of this, but you traditionally have a raw layer. And then we're going to prepare this data. So the second stage is to transform this data. And we can use Azure Data Factory for that. We can use Azure Databricks, and we can land it back in the data lake storage. And so maybe we have a clean layer in there. And that first cleaning could just be nothing more than making all the files Parquet. And so the prepare would just be a conformed layer. And then we can enhance it and clean it and master it and join it and do all these things. And again, that could be done in Data Factory and in Databricks. And then finally, we want to serve it, meaning we want to copy the data into a relational database, put it in that format. And then on the last stage, the fifth stage, is where we can visualize that. And this has been going on for many years. The product SQL Data Warehouse has been around for 5 or 6 years. And this worked well. However, some of the problems with this, or complexity of this, was I need to go and jump out to all these different areas to perform these activities. I have to go to the portal and create some storage. I have to go to Data Factory in another tab, create a workspace, Databricks in its own other tab, and creating a cluster. SQL Data Warehouse, again, Power BI, they all have their workspaces. So what we are trying to do with Synapse is to make this a lot easier by having one platform that can do all of that, one single pane of glass. And I'll run through demos to show you where I can do all of these activities without having to leave this one tab. So it's much more integrated and much easier to build out solutions. The confusion comes in, immediately Microsoft is very good at confusing people with their name changes. And this is where a lot of confusion came in, because we have Synapse Analytics as the name change to what was called SQL Data Warehouse, which is in GA. So that product had nothing but a name change. Now, there are many new features you see here on the left-hand side that have come and are coming into analytics, but we have a whole other version in private preview that is containing a bunch of other features that you only see if you join the private preview or if you use the private preview version. And this is what I'm going to cover today. So I'll talk maybe about some of the features that are in the GA version, but all those features are rolled into the public preview version, which I'm calling PP in this slide. And then we add a bunch of other features, and you'll see the big ones going along is what I'll demo. And at a high level, this is a slide that I created recently, and I have a blog about this just the other day, where it gives you a high-level overview of what is involved in this new workspace environment and what's new and what's part of what was in the GA. So if we look at this, everything's under a workspace, an Azure Synapse workspace, and you can create multiple workspaces. Underneath that workspace, the main thing you'll be using is Azure Synapse Studio, and this is the new product that creates that single pane of glass where everything we're going to do is going to be underneath that Azure Synapse Studio. And as a side note, look at what the acronym for Azure Synapse Studio is. So we've been having a lot of fun with that, with internally and with customers on there. Sometimes we don't think through some of these names in there. So Azure Synapse Studio, don't abbreviate it. Inside of Azure Synapse Studio is all these products you can use. And at the top level, you can ingest data into Synapse Studio. It's Synapse Analytics. And it's using Azure Data Factory. So if you're familiar with Azure Data Factory, you'll see in the demo, it's the same thing. And we don't call it Data Factory within it, but we have pipelines and data flows is what we use. And that ingest part will land the data in storage. Now you can land it into your traditional relational database or your data warehouse. And that is what we used to call the SQL Data Warehouse. It's the same concept. It's a relational database for your data warehouse. We have Data Lake Store Gen 2. It's your data lake that is Data Lake Store Gen 2 is our enhancement to what we used to call blob store, what we still call blob storage, and Azure Data Lake Store, what we now call Gen 1. We took the best features of both those products and put it into Gen 2. So that's your landing zone. It's schema on read. It's like a file folder. It's a glorified file structure now, and I can land data in there in any type of format on that. I also have what's new is the concept of Spark tables within Synapse. And if you're familiar with using Databricks, these are the Spark tables that you can create within Synapse. And we also recently introduced a link to Cosmos DB. So if you land data in Cosmos DB, that can be easily queried for reporting purposes or for importing it into your other storage inside of, say, maybe you want to copy it into your data lake or your relational database. So we have the ingest, we have the storage, but now we have to have compute on top of the storage. So we have three ways of doing that. We have the SQL provision. This is your traditional SQL data warehouse that has a one-to-one relationship with a relational database on there. So this is just like we have the GA version on there. But new is the SQL on-demand pools, which we are going to rename SQL Serverless. And this allows you to query data as it sits in these yellow arrows in Data Lake Store or in Spark tables or in Cosmos DB, and you're only charged when the queries run. So you don't have to provision anything. You just pay for when you run that query. And we also have Apache Spark. So this is an open source version of Apache that is inside of Synapse that can access any four of these storage devices and can use numerous types of languages to access that, like Spark SQL and Python. So you'll see these yellow arrows here are eventually will be pointed to all this storage, but right now there are some limitations. And when we go GA, we'll have all of those. So I'll demo some of these, but you can see some things we don't currently support, like SQL on demand doesn't yet go to a relational database, and the provision doesn't yet go to Spark tables, but that's coming down the road. And then finally, we have Power BI within this environment. And Power BI now can be used in multiple different ways. One is the traditional way where I call a provision pool and I run a stored procedure or run a query or execute a view, and it pulls data in from the relational database. That could be a direct query where it pushes down the query, or it can import the data into Power BI. But what's new, and this is getting a lot of interest from customers, is I can use Power BI on top of the SQL on demand pool to query data in the data lake. So think about this. I can land data quickly in the data lake stored Gen 2, and I can run a SQL on demand pool on top of that and call that through Power BI. So Power BI, the only time I'm being charged is the storage in Gen 2, which is extremely cheap, and when that query runs through the on-demand pool through Power BI. So this gets me a quick way to create a report. I can even use Power BI just to investigate the data and see if it's interesting or not. And I'm not having to fire up a provision pool. I'm not having to pay a lot of money up front for it. And so this opens up a whole other different world of possibilities, which I'll talk about. But this is very new, and SQL on demand, keep in mind, there's no database, it's just metadata. And inside of the on demand, I can create views or external tables that point to this data in the data lake, but there's no database associated with it. And so it uses this database at whatever it wants to point to, which is 3 out of the 4 right now. And then within this, we have the monitoring and management, and you'll see a lot of things that, if you're familiar with Data Factory, are ways to monitor that. And I'll go through in a demo the ways of securing some of this data. So a few minutes in, and I'll pause there, Kevin, if there's any questions in the chat room that have already come up.
Yes, on the prior slide, there was a question about what the other Azure Synapse Analytics GA box represented, the one I think at the top.
Oh, okay. The idea is everything in here and in here are going to be merged into one GA product. Now, this is something I was going to go over later, but to talk about it now is there'll be some migration. So if I'm doing something in GA, and this is important to know, I can do most of what you've seen in that next slide. I can do already. I can use Data Factory and Gen 2 and the SQL Data Warehouse in there. So when this public preview goes GA, I can migrate over because it's going to be a seamless process. It's essentially going to be a couple of clicks, and whatever you created in the SQL Data Warehouse and that database will be moved over, and whatever you want to move over from Data Factory can be moved into this Synapse Studio. And so the idea is these products, right now they're 2 separate ones. Eventually they'll be merged into one, and there'll be an easy migration path to move what you've done in GA into this new environment.
Great, thank you. That was the only question so far.
Okay, very good. So this opens up a whole other world of building out a managed data warehouse, and I'm going to have many conversations with customers on all the different options now, because you can see there's going to be plenty to choose from. If I look at this for exploring the data, just seeing what's out there, I can use the serverless. I can use a Synapse pipeline and Data Factory. I can use Spark. I have 4 options for transforming the data. I have a couple of ways to think about modeling and serving it, and eventually get into Power BI. And there's going to be trade-offs with each of these on there. You're going to have some trade-offs related to security, related to performance, or related to cost. And cost will be the biggest one, because serverless opens up a whole other world to save a ton of money and get near this performance that you would get in a provision. And it's also getting to some interesting conversations I was even having today, where I may not need to have data in a relational database anymore. If I'm building out a modern data warehouse, it used to be put everything in your data lake, and then copy all that data into relational databases. And there was very valid reasons for having both. And there still are some reasons on there, but I can see the argument being made in certain use cases that I may not need to copy my data into a relational database anymore. So I know I'm going to have a lot of questions with customers on that and have to explain the trade-offs on that. And you can expect future blogs. I'll dive into that more, but that's a common question I get from customers when they see these new features within Synapse. And so on-demand is a big part of this. And I can spend a couple hours just talking about the on-demand, but it'll be part of the discussion. And the ways to think about the service experience is auto scales, and it's not anything I have to start up or manage, and it also has an ability to auto terminate. And I'll show that in a couple of minutes. And so it's you're being charged on this for the data that's being processed, not on the resources. It's not being charged when nothing's being run. So this has a lot of fast performance, and that could be a long topic in itself. But when it's hitting data that's in a data lake, it could be JSON, it could be CSV or Parquet, and we have a lot of technology like CSV 2.0 and Direct Parquet that make it very fast performance. What that is will be a future white paper or blog post to go more in detail on that. And there's a few things out there now, but that's going to be a big part of understanding when to use provision over SQL on demand is what's the trade-off in performance on there. And then it's easy to use because it's schema on read, because I just land data in a data lake. It has automatic schema inference, meaning if I have data in a CSV which got a header or Parquet, I'm going to be able to automatically pull out the schema inside of that, so I don't have to do anything on top of it to tell it what that schema is. I also can now think of scenarios for serverless. There's really 3 of them. I can use it just for basic data exploration. You'll see in the demo, I can just right-click a file and I can open it up and see what's in there, and that's using this on demand. I have a logical data warehouse now I can use, so I don't have to move data into a relational database. I can query it as it sits. It could be sitting in Data Lake Store, and I can query it. It could be sitting in Cosmos DB, and eventually it could be sitting in the relational data warehouse that we have in Synapse, or SQL database, or SQL Server, or Teradata. That's all coming down the road. And I won't get into further down the road when we have Gen 3 and such, but there's a lot of exciting features come out that's going to expand this logical data warehouse out even further. And then the other one is data transformations. Now I can, because what this opens up is I can use T-SQL against this data. And if I can write T-SQL, I can use T-SQL for ETL. So maybe I prefer to use it that way. And so I can think of using on demand, writing T-SQL queries that are only being charged when they run, and using the on-demand along with a T-SQL for data transformations. I can even have Azure Data Factory, and one of the tasks could be execute this SQL and execute it using the on-demand feature. So I'm only paying when that particular task in Data Factory was run. And last slide before I get into some of the demo is there's a lot of options now for querying the data. So if we think of the 3 compute that I mentioned, provisioned, on-demand, and Spark, and we have 4 for now sources, and all of them could be a combination. So we have up to 12 different ways of querying the data. Now, not all of these are in, so I put an X, and some of them are coming soon. By the time it's GA, we'll have all these options on there, and there's a couple other caveats here and there. But you can do a lot with this product right now in public preview. It opens up a whole other world. It's going to make your life so much easier. So I'll pause there, Kevin, for questions, and I'm going to jump out to show you a little bit of what I've been talking about.
Okay, we'll see if there are any questions. There is about a 20-second delay from when you say something to when everybody out in Chatland actually hears it, just standard buffering. So it's anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds, depending on load. But so far, no questions yet. However, if any do come in, I'll forward them on.
Okay. I thought the delay was maybe if I start cursing, you can beat me, but I'll take it as some other reason. All right,
There's no
so
problem
this
about
is
swearing, no.
so what I will show you here is if I go into Azure portal and I type in Synapse here, you will see we have now 3 options. So one is SQL Data Warehouse. So this is the GA version. So if I choose this, I'm going to be limited to just that GA version I saw on the left on that slide where it's SQL Data Warehouse. I also have Workspaces preview in here. And this is what I will show in the demo. This is all the new stuff. And then this just came live the other day. It's another way to link to this Workspaces preview through a private link. So customers who want to sit behind a VNet can now use Synapse behind that private link on there. So I will be demoing this part right here, the second part in there. And what happens with this is I go to Synapse Analytics, the workspace preview, as you see here, and I can choose to add. And so this is basically creating a workspace, and it's really just a container. It's nothing fancy. It's just a way to break out things usually by projects, or maybe you have a dev, test, and prod. Maybe you're going to do it by certain groups or organizations within your company. HR and PR and payroll will get different ones in there. But in most cases, I see customers breaking it out by projects. So once I create a workspace, and you see I have 4 of them, I just go to this workspace, and you'll see all this information about it. And important to point out right away is I have the SQL endpoint, and I have one for on-demand. So I can use any product that can access SQL and use these endpoints. So I can go to SSMS, and I can type in that endpoint, and I can access everything I'm doing for the databases within Synapse Studio through SSMS or whatever tool of choices is. So while you can do everything within Synapse Studio, understand that DBAs, like I was, may want to use SSMS for certain things, and they're available to do that. And the big thing here is launch Synapse Studio. So once I click on this, I'll go into Synapse Studio. But before I do that, usually what you're going to manage here is the resources when it comes to creating the pools. And you'll see I have 2 options on here. I have this SQL pools and Apache Spark pools. So if I go into SQL pools, this is going to look like what you see now in GA under SQL Data Warehouse with its new name. But it's no different. I come in here and I can create pools that are SQL databases. And I can choose a performance level on here, and that's basically all you do. And once I do that, I can create as many as I want. Remember, there's a one-to-one relationship. Each of these pools has a database it can access. And just like Synapse Studio or SQL Data Warehouse was, I can pause and scale it down after I've created it. And I'm going to do something similar for Apache Spark. Now, the difference is, with these pools, I'm being charged as soon as I create the pool. Now I can pause it, save costs, scale it up and down, save costs, but I'm being charged when it's running, even if no queries are running against it. Apache Spark pools are a little different. If you're familiar with creating Apache Databricks, this will look familiar in here. And I can go and create one or many Apache Spark pools on here. And you can see I have the option to choose a node size. So right now we only have 3. But in here I can choose to auto scale, and I can choose the min and max number of nodes for that cluster on there. So it would auto scale up and down based on how many queries and the size of queries that are being sent to it. I also have an option under additional queries to auto pause it. So I can say after a certain amount of time, in this case 15 minutes, just shut down if no queries are accessing it. Now, there'll be a startup time for that, so that's the trade-off. But you'll find some of these startup times are extremely fast, and the same thing. And so essentially, I put it on my blog. It's a 95% style. Just take a up to 5 seconds for this. And that's because they have a bunch of these sitting by on warm standby. But there could be a couple minute delay for firing this up. So you gotta balance that against that trade-off against saving costs. But generally what most customers will do is, as I have pointed out here, you create multiple pools, and then you give certain people access to those pools. So maybe the very important people can access the large pool, and maybe others who it's not that big of a deal if their queries take longer, they can get access to a small pool. And they will be charged when this pool starts up and for as long as it runs. So if it takes 15 minutes to go into pause, that you're paying for that 15 minutes. So it's not quite pay per query, but it's sort of in between that and provisioned. And then once you do all that is when you'll dive into the workspace, and that's where you'll see this. So let me pause there if anything else came in, Kevin. You also give me a chance to take a drink.
So no questions so far.
Okay. And when we look at the workspace, this is what we see when we start out. So on the left here, we have all these options, and I'll play through them all. And then we have some, you can think of them as wizards to get started right away. It's these ones here, and I'll start out with ingest. So first thing I may want to do is, I want to ingest some data. So I click on this. If you're familiar with Data Factory, you'll see this looks just like Data Factory. The Data Factory copy data wizard that is in there. And I can go in here and decide I'm going to create a pipeline that's going to ingest data from a particular source. I can choose a source that has already been created, a connection to that, or I can create a new one. And this is where we have almost 100 different sources that you can access. And it's very simple. I just go in there and I create a new connection. I can even go to Amazon and I put all in the parameters. And then if I chose, say, a database, I can pick the particular data set in that database, or think of it as the tables I want to use. And so if I picked one here into my data warehouse, then I can choose existing tables or create a query. Once I do that, they'd say, well, this is where my source is. Many times this will be on-prem. And then I want to land it somewhere. Where do I want to land it? Okay, in the data lake. Well, all right, great. I'll go here and I'll choose data lake store, and I'll go and enter all the connection information. Or if somebody's has already done that, I'll just choose my enterprise data lake, and choose the location where I'm going to put all that in the folder and such. And then I go through all this, and then it'll run either one time, or I can create a schedule, and then right away I have data sitting in my data lake. And what this does behind the scenes is under orchestrate. Oh, I don't have one here. Let me pull up one of the other ones. You'll see under orchestrate, it'll create a pipeline. And in this case, it'll have the copy data pipeline. So all that information will be plugged into here, and I can choose to run it at a future schedule. But that is the way, right away, I get data in there. So it's using Data Factory pipelines and then landing it into the data lake that I usually will have created outside on the portal, and I'll create the data lake, and then I land it right in there. So as you'll see, as I didn't have to jump out and do anything, I did that right within the home, and I can then take it and expand on what I've created. So if I go back to here, you'll see this looks a lot like Data Factory, because it is. Underneath the covers is the same source code, and I can then expand on this. So I can decide, well, I'm going to copy data, but then I'm also going to call some Azure function, and I'm going to have that as the next step. And so this gets into the ins and outs of Azure Data Factory, which I won't cover, but Data Factory has a lot of options. If you look under here, you can see there's a lot of things you can do to build out your pipeline. And that could be just to move copy from point A to point B, land in a data lake. Maybe I want to then run a stored procedure against that data and clean it, and then copy it into the data lake. But most likely you're going to want to clean it using a feature of Data Factory called mapping data flows. So if we look at what that is, the idea is I take this data, I land it into raw part of the data lake, and then I need to clean it and land it back into the data lake, into a clean layer in there. And we've made it very easy with the data flows that are part of Data Factory that came out about a year ago. So if we look at this at a high level, I just create a bunch of tasks, and these tasks are taking data, in this case, a CSV file sitting in a data lake, and doing things with it. So it can convert and add columns, combine columns, aggregate data, and land it into a data lake, or in this case, I'm landing it right into a data warehouse on here. Each of these are steps along the way. I can add other steps in here, and you can see there's a lot of features. So if you're familiar with SSIS, it's the same idea. And part of this has a lot of flexibility and ease of use through this, because a lot of what you want to do is just dragging and creating these new experiences, these new tasks, and then going in there and setting the properties. So if I look at one of these and I want to do something a little more sophisticated, I go into this visual expression builder, which got all these functions in here that I can go and create, and it has the ability to tell me with a little bit of help, pop up help in there, and it makes it very easy to use these functions on here. And interestingly enough, behind the scenes, everything I do in here is written into JSON code. And when I go to choose to execute this, it takes that JSON converts it to Scala, and runs it on a Spark cluster. So I like to say you're putting a pretty face on Spark through mapping data flows. And so this makes it very easy for customers to take data, copy it into the data lake, and then transform it using mapping data flows. There's many ways you can clean the data. This is one of the newer ways, but also one of the most popular ways now because it's so easy to use. Everything I create is going to be saved within this develop. And so again, before I would have to jump out into Data Factory and do all this. Now I'm staying within Synapse Studio, never having to leave it. I'll pause there if anything came across, Kevin.
You're still good.
All right, cool. So everybody's understanding this completely.
Sounds like
or
it.
if they just don't want to ask questions. But anytime pop in questions, I'll be making frequent stops along the way to answer them. If we then look at the data tab, let me go back to this other workspace. And here you see I have a couple of storage accounts. Now, the way I was able to access them is under Manage. This has these link services, and this allows me to go and say I want a new link service, and I can link in Data Lake Store Gen 2. And I can link in Power BI and blob storage, and eventually, and Cosmos DB, and eventually other things in here. So once I link it in, I can then forever go and use it within Synapse Studio. So here you can see I linked in a couple of Data Lake Store Gen 2. And under this one, I just created a bunch of folders, which I can do here. And then underneath these folders, I uploaded a bunch of sample files. So let's look at this. I have Parquet files here. Now, if you're familiar with the way you would have to explore these files before, meant, all right, I land my data in a data lake. It's a Parquet file, and I want to read it. Let me go to Databricks. Let me create a cluster, fire it up. Let me link to the storage here, which in itself could be a pain. And once I link to this storage account, I can then use Spark SQL and query the data. Well, I also then have to use a different type of SQL. It's not regular T-SQL. And that was could be a very big pain if you're not familiar with it, and it'd also be costly to do that all. What I can do now, when I see this, is I right-click it, I go New SQL Script, I hit Select Top 100, and I click Run. Now, what this does, in a matter of 2 seconds, is I'm now looking at what's inside that file. Because it's Parquet, it had definitions of the headers, which I pulled out. I can go into Chart, and you can see over here on the right, I got all these chart types, so I can start playing with this data as it is, and I have some basic charting capabilities. So this is a great way to explore and see what is in this data that people land in here that maybe I'm not familiar with. The magic to this is this open row set, and this allows me to query data in a data lake, and it passes in the pointer to the data lake. And you can see it's using this Parquet file. I could use multiple Parquet files. So if I go back to miscellaneous, I can actually just select more than one of these and do that. And now you see I have 3 Parquet files, and it comes back instantly. I can even put an asterisk here and filter out and say, give me everything that's in this folder. So all that's open for you. And then I can expand on this where I can go and increase my where clause. I can say, and say tweet equals blah, blah, blah. And I can just add all that in there. So this is regular T-SQL on that. So I get the benefits of it's fast. I just right-clicked it, and I automatically have the ability to attach to it, and I can use regular SQL on it. So that's a big game changer, because a lot of times customers did not like having to go and use Spark SQL or some other flavor, and it's cheap. I'm only being charged when that query was run, no provisioning. So this is the big game changer with that. And that was just Parquet. I can do the same thing against CSV and JSON files on there. And right now, there's a little inconsistency with the way each of those files work, but eventually it'll be consistent. And what I mean by that is I see new SQL script, I see new notebook, and so it works a little differently. I'll show you in the CSV. But also, if I decided I wanted to query this Parquet, but I like Spark and I want to use a notebook, if I click notebook, I can then attach to a small pool. So this command up here is where you just pick the pool that you want to use, and it's now going to start a Spark session on here. And you can see it did a lot of the work for me. It has this link, because we're using Azure Active Directory, to access data sitting in the data lake is a no-brainer. It just gets the command. I can do it. So that's a big difference than doing something in Databricks or another product on there. And this is taking a little bit because I didn't pre-provision it, and I'm not using something warmed up, so it'll take a couple of minutes. But it'll come back and it'll have the Spark output from that. And then generally, what you do is, this is my starting point, and I just start building a notebook. So I can add code here and add text in here, and I can start building out a Spark notebook in there. So now I can have 2 options that I've just showed you. I can use Spark or T-SQL against data in the data lake, and I'm using either a Spark pool or Spark on demand on it. So very easy to use, especially if you've done it other ways. And this is what's awesome about it. And if I go into the CSV, you'll see there's a little consistency. We don't have the top 100 in there yet, or the notebooks on there, but we do have oh, wow, they don't have it. They do have ability to create a data flow and a data set from it. And if we dive in here, we also have the ability to preview it. And that's the first on here. And this preview will eventually be in the other ones too. But instead of doing a select top 100, this is sort of easier. I can preview it, and I can see right in here that it pulled this from the CSV file. It found all the headers, and right now boom, I got it right there. And so that preview feature is really cool. They don't have the top 100 built in there yet, but I can also just go into the query. I can query it this way, and so it works. It just doesn't have the right click option in there yet. And you can see this is also using CSV, the parser 2.0, which is a faster way of accessing CSV data. And then same thing if I have JSON in there. If I go to the JSON and right click it, you can see I can do the notebook and the preview on that. So great, easy way to see what's sitting in there. So those 3 data files. Now, if I have something else outside of those 3 data files, then I don't want to use a Spark notebook, because Spark can handle any type of data formats. And you can imagine, yes, we will have additional ones that can be used with on-demand, that in addition to JSON, CSV, and Parquet. Next, I think it will be Avro, and a bunch of others are on the roadmap. So pause there, Kevin.
Chat has been quiet.
All right.
Speaking up, oh, just got a question. Is the new CSV parser part of the .NET framework?
Yes, there you can use that 2.0 if that's what you're talking about on, if you saw it on here. There's this that can be part of the .NET framework. So, and this gets into, we have API calls for all the data that you want to access in the notebook or in the data lake store Gen 2. So if I want to do something outside of this, whether it's in .NET and whatever language you want to use, I can call the API calls to get access to data in the data lake as another option on there. So yes is the answer. In most cases, when somebody's building a data warehouse, they're going to do everything within Synapse Studio. But if you want to do it and you want more flexibility, more features, this is where you kind of progress from going from doing stuff into mapping data flows and data factory. I can then do data with T-SQL in here, and then I can even do data outside of this in my own language to do transformations and such.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So if we look at the data on here, we also have the option to hook into Cosmos DB, which I won't go into, but it's show off, but it's a Synapse link. So this it's called Azure Synapse Link. This means if you have a data Cosmos DB and you're landing data in there, and you want to run reports, well, you don't want to run reports right against that data. Also because with the format of Cosmos DB being this NoSQL solution, it's could be very slow to run reports against data that's spread out all over the world. So within that Cosmos DB, that data is copied over into a different format within Cosmos DB that can then be linked to through Synapse. So the very cool thing is I can write a query that can link data from Cosmos DB with data in the CSV file, with data in a Parquet file, and return the results. And I'm never moving any of that data into Synapse. I'm rather keeping it as it is, but joining it all that way. Of course, the trade-off will be speed, but that can be fine. Maybe you're using it just to explore data or a one-time report or for ETL. And imagine down the road when we open it up to all these other different sources of data. So I can, in that same link, I can link to SQL Server on-prem and to Oracle and to Teradata. It's pretty incredible what it will be. So that's a really true federated query approach. Jumping over to this Develop tab. This is where we have the ability to save scripts. So this makes things a little more convenient. Everything I want to do, I can just save out. So this is like SSMS and open a .SQL files in there. We just made it a little easier. Eventually, this will be notebooks, SQL notebooks that we have in Azure Data Studio, but right now it's just opening up a SQL file. And we do have a tab for notebooks for Spark notebooks. So let me jump over to another one and show you something a little more sophisticated. Let me pull one in here. So if I look at a notebook, this is a product recommendation notebook on here. So this is open source Apache. And first thing I want to do is import a bunch of libraries. And then you'll see I have this connect statement or this load statement that's accessing the data. So this is where usually you right click and select top 100 and you just copy that code into here or it's used as a starting point. So right away I connect to that data source. And then from there on, I can use it just like when any other Jupyter notebook on here. So I can start using Spark SQL, or in this case, you'll see in this drop-down list, I have 4 choices. R is eventually coming. I'm using Python on here, and I am querying data. I am now going to train a model, so I'm using some machine learning, and I'm pulling in the data from the data lake, the CSV file, and training the machine learning model with it. And then I'm eventually going to run and query, and what it's doing is doing some product recommendations on here, and then eventually writing out the result back into the CSV file into location within Data Lake Storage Gen 2. So this is where we have customers who like Spark and they want to continue using it, and they can do it within Synapse. They can also do it within Data Factory, mapping data flows. They can use T-SQL. So we're giving all the options underneath one roof. Now, the other thing that we can connect to, so we talked about, we got data, we move it in, we transform that data, we clean it all, and we can also then land it and copy it into the data, to the Synapse Data Warehouse on there. So if I look at some of where I've previously done that, under Orchestrate, you'll see I'm taking, let me find out when I did it. Oh, maybe it was under this one. Oh. So I didn't have it. So this is where okay, this is it, where I take the data from a source on-prem, land it into the data lake, and then I use mapping data flows, which takes that data from the data lake and then lands it into the CSV, into the data warehouse, the SQL data relational database on here. It does other things. It also takes the data from the data warehouse and lands it into Parquet format into the data lake. So lots of options on here. And now when I get the data into the data lake and or into the data warehouse, I want to do things with that. I want to run reports off that. And so what we've added was integration into Power BI. So under Manage, this is where I can do a link service. And you can see here, I created this Power BI workspace. So I created this Power BI workspace outside of Synapse, and I can now link to it. So this means, to try to clear up some confusion you may have, is this Power BI workspace now can be accessed from two locations. I can write Power BI reports within Power BI service, or I can access those reports within the Power BI, within Synapse, which I'll show now. But either way is fine for creating and modifying reports. And the way I modify those reports or create new ones within Power BI is I go to the Develop tab, and underneath here you see Power BI. So I connect this little workspace. Once it does that, it pulls in everything it found in the workspace. In this case, I have some Power BI data sets that I created that are accessing this data in the data lake or the data warehouse, and then I just create Power BI reports. So it's using the data set, you'll see, in all the fields that I have to build out my report. And so when I save this report here, it could also be accessed outside of this. And if somebody logs into powerbi.com and they go into their workspace where this is residing, they can access the report that way. Under Power BI data sets, this is where I can come in here and I create a new Power BI data set. So what it'll do is say, okay, we're going to create this data set within Power BI desktop. So make sure you have it installed. And when I start this, it's going to say, what data source do you want to use? I can use that on-demand pool that I've created, or I can use a pre-provisioned one. Either one I choose, when I hit continue, it's going to give me this PBIDS file, and that's essentially a connection to this service, and then I can go into desktop and start creating the report off of it. So this is a quicker way than having to go and create your own connection yourself, which I showed you on that workspace where we had all that connection information. So this is essentially taking this for you and creating the link and doing the security to connect to it. So it's saving you a couple of steps. And so I have that data set, and once I create that data set, it'll show up here as something I can use to build out reports. So all this could be done within Power BI. Within Synapse Studio, I don't have to go to use desktop. I could have built it out and created a new report here if I wanted to. under this, or where is it? The new Power BI report. I could have just done it that way and created choose the data set to create that report. All right, let me pause there for some questions.
Looking good so far.
All right. Now, a little other thing to manage on here. So we talked about creating these pools. I did this externally before, and here I created them. I can also go into this spot here. It's the same thing, and I can manage those pools that way. So let me get rid of my Outlook. So I could do what I need this way, again, without having to leave Synapse Studio. So here's where I can pause things. And I have the link services I showed. I also have the ability to create things that are used for Data Factory. And this is the integration runtimes and the triggers. And then access control gets into allowing me to set up who can access this workspace. And right now, we don't have a lot to it. We're adding more. But I can decide who can use the workspace, who can create SQL pools, and who can create Apache Spark pools. Now, if you think about, well, how do I limit data to, say, people who can only see certain folders in the data lake? Well, that is all handled through Azure Active Directory, and that's handled through the data linkage. When I went back to here, to my enterprise data lake, and when I pull this up, you'll see on here the ability to handle the security of who can access what on here. And that's what that managed access part is right there. So if I click on that, then it says, all right, James, who do you want to give access to this finance folder? And this is where I can set all that. I can also do this outside of the data of Synapse inside the portal if I wanted to, but why exit out of Synapse Studio when you can do everything within here? So everything you do outside of this will carry forward into this and prevent people from accessing a directory, a file or folder that they shouldn't have. And then under Monitor, this is where we can go and view everything that we've created previously. And if you've used Data Factory before, this will look familiar. So anything I've ran, let's see if I can pull one up here, will show up on here. Get the lighter out of me. I thought I had something in here. So if I jump into this, this is where I can do some debugging. I can look and see what succeeded or failed. I can dive into this with this little sunglasses or glasses, and this jumps in to gives me detail about everything that was run and all the execution rows and times and such. And then you can see over here, I got a bunch of information about it. And so this is same thing you'll see in Data Factory, but it's integrated within here, so I can help to debug things as I'm going through them all. And I also see Spark applications. So I don't know if I have any Spark ones in here, but I can then click on any of the Spark ones. Oh, I do have one. Let's see when it succeeded. And this gives me all the Spark history information. So you have to be a little familiar with how Spark runs. And I can then jump into some of these. And this is the one case where it jumps out to another tab, and I can see all the information about the Spark job that was run. And then SQL requests will come in where I may want to go in here and do some performance tuning where I want to see what was run in and see if I can then adjust it and make it faster. Now, I can continue to use any third-party tools, or I can write against DMVs, for those familiar with SQL Server, as ways to see what queries are running slow and performance tune those and look at the query plans. You can do some of that within here. This is going to be expanded, and then otherwise you can do it within We have monitoring tools within Azure Portal. So these could be used to monitor SQL Synapse, but they can also be used to monitor VMs and anything else, a lot of other things on here. We also have an advisor under here. So this could be used, again, this is to monitor everything in Azure Portal, but I can limit it to say I only want to look at a particular type of data, which could be my Synapse pools. And in that case, I can come on here and say, just show me what's going on with my Synapse pools. And I will get a bunch of recommendations on there. They could be recommendations on how to save costs. And it can say, look, you're utilizing things. They could be on security, that it could say you should be setting some more security based on what you told me to track. It could even be, you can say, look, we're under HIPAA requirements, so tell me when I'm out of HIPAA compliance. And they come back and say, you need to have TDD encryption enabled on yours. And then there's things where you can look into reliability, and then performance is one where there's a lot we can do. It can recommend indexes you put on things. It can recommend different query plans. So this will work against everything in Synapse. And then we have the monitoring tools on here that I wanted to show. So I can go into metrics, and I can go and pull down that I want to keep track of what's going on with, say, CPU within Azure Synapse. And so I would, well, I don't have it set up here. So it'll pull down the metrics. So I can say, show me the CPU and track that. And then I can set up alerts that can say, hey, when the CPU is over 80% for 5 minutes, send me an alert. So this can do a lot. Maybe not as much as some third parties. So if you want to continue using third parties to track all this, you can, because you have those SQL endpoints, and it's just a matter of connecting to it on that. All right. Let me pause there.
Looks good.
All right, so I'm going to jump back a little bit to some of the slides, because I often find customers don't quite understand the MPP technology. So I wanted to touch on that really quickly. You may be used to an SMP world. That's regular SQL Server. It's ability I can scale up, and that can work great up to a certain point. So if I'm finding queries are running slow, how do I speed them up? Well, I get new hardware, and I go through that pain of upgrading the hardware, backup, restoring everything, testing it all out. MPP came along, and if you're familiar with it, when the test Netezza or Teradata, it's the same idea that I can scale out. So I can take data and I can spread it among multiple disks, and I can fire up multiple VMs, compute options, to run in parallel against that data. So a customer gave me this great analogy. He said, it's like having a deck of cards of 52, and I need to find the Jack of Hearts. Well, I can flip through it, and it may take a while. Now I can upgrade myself, I can scale up, and I can be faster. It still may take me a while to find that Jack of Hearts. Well, if I instead take those 52 cards and find 26 people and give them each 2 cards and have them turn them over, it's going to be much quicker. I'm going to find that Jack of Hearts very fast. And that's the idea of scaling out. And I can just add more people. I can eventually add up to 52 people. So it's very fast. So the way that looks in Synapse is I have this idea of control nodes, and the queries are submitted to that control node. And I have a little, I can pull this up. Whoop. Let me do my here. So I have the idea I can submit a query to the control node, and it will take that control node and create a query plan, but it parallelizes that query plan. So it's doing a little bit more than you may see in SQL Server. And then it distributes that among all the different compute nodes, which each have a piece of the data, run that locally, send it back, mash it up, and send it back to the end user. That all complexity is hidden from them. They don't realize all this compute stuff's going on. but this is the way we get that scale out and performance. So queries will generally go 2,200 times faster when you're using Synapse than regular SQL Server. And I will run demos where I'll have 20 billion rows of data, and I'll run a query that's doing joins against 7 tables, and it'll come back in 8 or 9 seconds. Same kind of query you run in SQL Server will take minutes, if not hours, on there. And the great thing is most T-SQL supported still, so you can migrate on-prem into here, and it depends. You could have some conversions, but we have an assessment tool that'll go through and look at your code and see if there's any T-SQL that needs to be changed. But for the most part, you can migrate over and not have to learn something new. You can continue using the same T-SQL. And a little bit of details on this is, if I created a star schema where I have one large table, I will use that table and distribute that among all these different storage. However, smaller tables, if we're using a star schema, those we'll call dimension tables, I can replicate those to all those different nodes because they're small and storage is cheap. And I get the benefit of when I'm running that query locally and that fact table is joining to those dimension tables, I don't have to move data around. It's all there locally. I can do that join. If I didn't have that distributed, that means I have to do what's called shuffling, and that could make the query take longer because it's got to move data around among the compute nodes. But we can avoid that by spending some time thinking about how we want to distribute that. And that's where I usually sit with DBAs for a couple of days, and we go through the difference when you're scaling out, and they get it, and they design it properly, and they have the queries run extremely fast compared to what they're used to. Those distributions, what we show in here, and the only difference in the create table statement is where we have the distributions. How do we want to distribute that data to get proper skew? And there's a hash table, there's round robin, there's replicated. Won't go into those, but that's where we educate DBAs. So there's nothing new they have to learn other than that distribution command. And once they use that, it'll automatically create all the tables for you among all those different distributions. And we have the ability to scale up and down the data warehouse units, up and down. And what that does when you scale it up is, if I start out with the lowest setting, so I have 60 distributions. So that's the way it is within Synapse, that take those big files. If you decide you want to split them up on their hash key, it'll split all them up among those 60s. If I stick to the lowest performance tier, DD100, I'm only going to have one worker node. So I'm really not going to have much scale out. So if I increase the worker node, the DW to say 600, I now have 6 worker nodes that are running against those storage blobs. So I just keep increasing it all the way up into, what do we have to 30,000 now, which essentially means 1 worker node per VM. So 60 VMs are running. So this is why we can scale up, and it only takes a couple minutes to scale up because we're not having to move data around. We're just creating additional VMs. And so this is the difference between the scale out architecture and the scale up architecture that most people are used to. So a little bit about MPP, and that's really the only difference you'll have to get used to if you're a DBA or a developer when you move to the MPP world, is understanding those little caveats on there. So taking a sip of water and seeing, Kevin, if you have any questions.
No questions here.
All right. Oh, that makes it tough. I don't have a chance to rest. So that's fine. Unless, Kevin, you want to start singing or telling some jokes.
Both of those would be a really bad idea.
Okay. All right. So I'll keep at it. So this gets into a little bit about the differences that you get with Synapse inside of this MPP engine. And a lot of times I'll get asked, what are other optimizations you can do to this SQL Data Warehouse on there? And anything you can do, for the most cases, anything you can do on-prem, you can do within Synapse inside this Synapse Studio is in there. I can create column cluster stored indexes, which are essentially a giant index you will have on top of your data. And that could be unlimited size in there. I can also have heap tables, which are no indexes. I can do some non-clustered indexes. So literally some performance enhancements you can have. That's very much like what you have on-prem. Same thing with partitioning. I can do that same concept in the cloud, within Synapse, within MVP technology, and get additional benefits. Although it's going to be 20 times faster than on-prem, without doing partitioning, you can increase that even more with doing partitioning. And in this deck, I'll make available to you, Kevin, so you can share it out. And so it goes into some of the details on that. But a couple of things I wanted to point out that are added to Synapse or SQL Data Warehouse that you don't see in your SMP world, and that is materialized views. So the idea is, well, I can create views, and that's just to create an abstraction layer, because the views can hide the complexity of having to join multiple tables together. But they don't give you any performance benefit. Well, materialized views do give you performance benefit, because what they do is they take a copy of that data that you're joining in the table, and they create another table from it and index it. And so if I create a query on top of that data in one of those tables or multiple tables, it'll use the materialized view instead. And the other benefit, so the benefit over a regular view is, in a regular view, I have to specify I want to use a regular view. Here, I don't. I create a materialized view, and the query plan will look at what you want to query. And in this case, if you queried and you said, I want to query data in sales order detail, it'll go, oh, wait a minute, forget it. I'm not going to query sales order table, because your query is wanting to do a sum, and I've already done that in this materialized view. I'm just going to use a materialized view, and it'll replace, it'll redirect it from the actual table to the materialized view, which has its own table. So this is where you get tremendous speed and performance. And so what you want to do as you're building out solutions, if you're getting some common queries, you can create a materialized view on them, and therefore creates an extra table, puts an index on it, and those views, those queries will go tremendously faster using materialized views. So that's one thing that gives you performance. And I go through and I have an examples on here in more detail. And the other, and this is cool. This explain recommendations. You can even put a query in here, and if you put explain recommendations, it'll actually come out and say, well, we recommend you create a materialized view on this. So it's pretty cool what this can do. So keep that in mind. The other cool thing is the result set caching. When I create a query in SQL Data Warehouse, when I run a query on there, it'll cache that query. And if somebody else submits a query that's exactly the same, it'll just use what's in cache. So a query that could take 10 seconds, 1 minute, 10 minutes, an hour, will take milliseconds, because the result was already being in cache. There are some exceptions to that. If you're doing things like role of security, then you put a where clause on that, and that won't be cached because of the passing in the end user's name. And there's a couple other caveats that are explained out on a link that I have on here. I think I have it on. I can't remember where I put that. I'll add it to this, but that'll explain some of the exceptions to the rule. And then it's 1 terabyte in size, so it won't work for extremely large data sets. And eventually, over time, if you have thousands of queries, it'll start unloading some of those. The last in, first out, is that how you say it? The first in, last, I can't remember. But the older queries will be pulled out of there, and the new queries will come in there. And by default, this is not on, so you want to turn this on in most cases, and then you're going to get an extra benefit. So having materialized views and having the query, the results of cache, leads to tremendous performance. And so you can then say, well, I can use Power BI on top of SQL, the Synapse relational database. Well, I never would have done that before, because if I have a dashboard, that may take too long to run queries, even though it's very fast, 20 times faster. It could be could take 10 seconds in between slicing and dicing a dashboard. But if I create a materialized view, maybe it only takes 1 or 2 seconds. If I use results like caching, it's only going to take milliseconds. So I can now, in some cases, create dashboards in Power BI right on top of this, because it also helps with an issue where you only have a limited number of concurrent connections or queries that you can run. If you run results like caching, it bypasses that limit, and I'm not using any of those concurrency slots. So I can utilize this, and because dashboard queries usually are going to be the same over and over again, you may find that dashboards work very fast against Synapse, and you don't have to import the data on that. So there's a lot of discussion I have with customers on when you want to import, when you want to use something like direct query or aggregation tables in Power BI. So it's just important to know all the choices you have, and then you can decide what works better, and maybe use a POC to test it out in your case.
There was a question on a prior slide. I think it was in the speaker notes. Current limitations about materialized views.
Yeah, I thought I had a link to that too, but maybe I don't. I'll put it in there. So the idea is there's certain cases where you can't create a materialized view on certain types of data, but there are very few of those. And there's limits. Oh, here it is. This is the aggregations, is what it supports. So if you try to do something outside of this, an aggregation, it won't work. So keep that in mind when you're building these out.
Are these the same rules as in like on-premises SQL Server indexed views?
Pretty close. They're not exactly the same, but pretty close.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Good question. And I had a blog on this I'll just pull it up, where I compared all of these. So you may want to take a look on that. And I also just recently posted this yesterday, where I go more into detail on the on-demand. So you may want to read through this, because there's a lot of the common questions I've been getting, and I put in here. And I'll expand on this with other blogs, because there's so much to talk about as far as use cases when you have on-demand. And then for the Power BI, where we get into the performance trade-offs, if we look at Azure Synapse Analytics and the Power BI performance, I went and did testing. And so I first defined all the different options within Power BI. And then if you look on here, you can see that, oh, no, my link on it. I can have different ways of using features within Power BI and then features within Synapse. So it can first look at the results at caching, and then maybe some things are in memory and different caching that it uses, materialized views. And then I kind of compared some of these, including using aggregation tables, to show you the difference in all this. So you may want to take a look at that too. All right, going back to the last thing I wanted to cover, we're an hour and 15 minutes in, is some of the workload management. So this is new. This is something you kind of see this a little bit within Resource Manager in SQL Server, but this takes it to a whole other different level. And in Synapse, you can define these resource classes. So I can define, there's 4 by default. They're dynamic, and then there's some static ones. So basically, it means dynamic means I'm going to get 70%, and if it increases, if I scale up, I'm going to get 70% of the new scale up. Where the static would be the same no matter what you scale up or down to. Now, workload management has 3 options in here: classification, importance, isolation in there. So if we look at classification, this allows me to create think of it as a group that I'm going to create, and I'm going to put people in this group. And people inside this group, I'm only want to give them certain access to certain resources. So that means I can say this group is only going to get a certain percentage of the CPU. And if they're in this group, whenever they run, if nobody else is using it, they will get 100%. But otherwise, they're going to be limited to what I put in the classifier. I can also specify in this classifier the importance of that group and the people inside that group. And the way that works is I can make people skip ahead. So before, I'd have everything in a queue, and you would just not get access to the compute until you had your turn in the queue. Now, if I give somebody a higher importance, what happens is they can cut in front of everybody and get access to compute power before other people on that. So that's another way of dividing up the resources that someone can use. And so if I talk about the classifications on here, I can specify, you'll see up here that you'll get a certain percentage of resources. So in this case, they can get a min to a max of 60 to 100, and then concurrency slots. So this is essentially giving them certain pieces of the pie. You can go up to 128 concurrency slots, but I can say for certain people, I only want to give them a little bit of that. And then the isolation means, so combining the classification with the importance is where you'll get, I'll show you here, the ability to go and create a work group. And in this case, I want to give this work group isolation of 20 to 100. And you can also just request grant, so that's another thing you can limit. I can then say, I want to classify this work group. So I have this data loads here. In addition to going from 20 to 100, I also can classify them as high importance. Now I could have put this in here, but this gives you flexibility into sort of mixing and matching how you want to do this. And I'm using this ETL login. So anybody under, I can have one individual in here, or I can have multiple. I can specify one individual here, or I can specify a group name. So most times customers put a group name in Active Directory, and then they add people to that group name. And so that's one way of doing it. I can also just have these default work groups. I showed you there's 4 of them. So think of this classification as I'm enhancing these workload groups, and I'm adding a bunch of customized ones, and that's what the data loads. When I create this data loads, it creates a work group that has its own set of resources. So this is where we can do a lot with this. Hey, I have this limited resources. I can scale it out, but I don't want to have one person go and overwhelming and using all the resources. So I can create these workload groups, and I can break them out by group of people, like HR and finance have their own, or I can break it out by dev, test, and prod, or I can break it out by particular groups of people, like the programmers or so the data scientists. So there's a lot of flexibility in here to prevent people from overloading the system, to prevent people from spending too much money on it by limiting the resources they can use. So I see customers using a lot of this when they are building out solutions for controlling costs and for controlling resources and preventing, say, a handful of people of submitting all these queries that are overwhelming things. And now I got to run some login or some ETL loading, and that stuff can't run because people are running these queries and they're overwhelming everything. Well, I can put them in a group that gives them lower CPU percentage, and I can add ETL group to be max percentage and also have high importance, so they will cut in front of those other people and such. So there's a lot you can design in building this out with the solution on there, but this gives you a tremendous amount of that flexibility to not make people complain that their queries are taking too long, or reports are not getting run, or the loading jobs are taking too long. All right, pause there for questions.
No questions.
All right. That's okay. So I'm going to go another 10 minutes because I do have a deck that's 340 slides now, but I'm not going to show that one. This one has 63 slides, and I'm just going to go through a few more of them. So I mentioned we have dynamic management views. So for those who like using those in SQL Server, you can continue using them as a monitoring tool within Synapse. I mentioned before, any developer tools, because we have that SQL endpoint, you can use any one of these 5 products to access the data, as well as any third-party tools we'll mostly use against that. Here's the advisor recommendations that I was showing you before, and to deep dig in, is these are some of the things you will see in advisor. It can show you don't have the table distributed correctly, you have data skew, there's a bunch of cache misses, there's temp DB contention, you haven't chosen the best plan on there, and it'll not only tell you what's wrong, but then it'll have options for fixing that. Sometimes there's a one fix option. Say press this button and we'll go in this example, bottom one, create updated table statistics for you. We also have maintenance windows. So this is the great thing about a PaaS solution, is gone are the days where you have to do upgrades and patching. And when I was a DBA, that was the biggest pain in the neck, was always having to patch things and take it down and schedule times to do that and test things for that. With a PaaS solution, Microsoft does all that because, well, there's no VM you have to worry about, but there is a VM somewhere. Underneath the covers, this is all running on VMs. And so Microsoft at times will have to patch those VMs. And that may require a maintenance window where you may have some interruption. And you may say, well, that's a problem. I don't want to have the interruption during some peak hours. So you can set this maintenance schedule where you can specify when you want that patching to done. So that could be operating system patching, Synapse itself patching, or upgrades where we're adding new features to it. And you will get an email that'll tell you that, hey, this stuff's going to be run. You may patched. You may see some brief interruptions on there. I get those emails maybe once every 3 or 4 months, and they usually are from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., even though I don't have a maintenance window. And they usually say your database will be down for a couple minutes here and there. I don't stay up to 2 to 4 to find out, but I've never heard complaints that where it was down for more than a couple of minutes. So it's a great way to avoid having to do patching, but also not colliding with something important that you may be doing. And the last thing I want to mention is we do have streaming within Synapse. So I could do this outside of Synapse too. I can create an event hub or an IoT hub, and I can use Azure Stream Analytics, but we've built it in now to the product. So it makes it even easier to stream data in. You'll just have these setup screens. Inside of that, you can see you have this view streaming jobs here on the bottom left that you'll click, and you'll specify the input source, that event hub or IoT hub. You'll specify the output source, usually a table within Synapse or a data lake. And then you'll go and write the queries that you want to use for Stream Analytics to take the data from the input and aggregate it or filter it and land it into the data lake or into Synapse. And you just go and execute it or schedule it out. And that's yet another feature that is integrated within Synapse Studio, so you don't have to leave that environment to have these features in there. And eventually we're going to have other products added into the environment. You'll see data sharing as one, but then you'll also see third-party products like Databricks eventually will be part of Synapse Studio, where you can link to their workspace and then run it within that. It probably won't have the same ease of use of integrating with data lake storage and stuff, but the hope is that it'll be another option you can use for those of you that like Databricks and want to integrate it within Synapse. Will have that ability. Oh, yeah, and I will mention this. The last thing was snapshots and restores. So you can back up. There is backup that goes on with Synapse. Now, it's always an interesting conversation with customers because they may have databases that are 100 terabytes and they don't really want to back them up. Usually, a lot of times customers will not want to back up and they'll just say, we'll have to rebuild it from scratch. But they didn't back it up because it's too costly to do that. However, we've made it easier, but we have these automatic backups of the data warehouse on there. So it'll go through and back up the database, and it does this, and it keeps those backups for 7 days. It usually does it every 8 hours on there, and it also takes that backup and copies it over to another data center. So that means if I have my Synapse in the East Coast and something happens and the whole East Coast goes down, I can go to the paired region, which would be US Central, and I could say I want to start a Synapse database and I want to restore it from a database that was in the East Coast, and it'll restore that, and it does it in under 20 minutes, no matter the data size, because of the snapshots. So I've done demos where I've taken 20 terabyte databases, and within about 5 or 6 minutes, it restores it all. And so you have these frequent snapshots going. You can also, and it's automatic, you can also trigger a snapshot. So if you're going to do something, maybe a data load, and you want to make sure you have some restore point before you can execute that snapshot. And I think it keeps up to what is it, 20 snapshots you can have going. And so no need to worry about backups when you go to Synapse. That's taken care of for you. All right, cool. So Kevin, are we having any questions there?
No questions have come in.
All right.
Very clear explanation.
Or everybody's falling asleep. So we're gonna say that I've done a good job on this. And yeah, I really went through the whole deck. It's about an hour and a half. I think I'll start losing my voice pretty soon. So I will share this with you, Kevin. I don't know if you can share it with the group, but I'll make this available.
Yeah,
for any of you who have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on my email here, and I will reply. I even have a larger deck if you want it. That's 300 and something, that has everything you've ever wanted to know about Synapse. And I'm in the middle of updating that deck right now. It should be done within the next couple of days, and I will send that out to those who want it too. And if you want to have another demo for your company, that's something we can usually arrange, and I can show them the demo and go into more detail about certain other areas that you want a deeper dive in. And I will end with the question I get is, when is this going to be GA'd? And I wish I could tell you for sure, but the program managers get angry at me if I specify a date. All I will say is what they said publicly is that the hope is that it will be GA by the end of this calendar year. So that is my hope too. We got a few months to go. It's been in public preview now for about 4 or 5 months. And before that was private preview for a long time, and it looks very stable. When I run through it, there's a few features that they need to add and a few bugs here and there, but it's working very good. And we actually do have some customers that are using it in production. And that's because the SQL database part of that already is GA'd. It's these other features that are not there yet. So you can say part of Synapse solution is GA'd. And so they're able to work around some of the bugs they may see in some of those other features that are not as maybe sensitive as the database part of that. All right. Anything else, Kevin?
No, that timeline makes a lot of sense. You got some thank yous in chat. So I will also say thank you so much for taking the time out of your evening to talk to us about Synapse Analytics.
Yeah, very happy to do it. I hope you got something out of this. Again, don't be shy about sending me out a email, and I hope to come back when Synapse is GA'd and then have all these other new features I can talk about, Kevin.
Very nice. Yeah, we'll follow up offline later.
Yeah, and there's a Gen 3 that's coming out too, and that I can talk about later. So that'll be another user group meeting that we can have.
Absolutely. So with that, we are gonna wrap up this evening's meeting. Thanks everybody for attending or for watching later on. If you do have questions, I will get the slide deck. We'll post it, but please feel free to reach out to James. And we'll see you all next time.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.